important thing, which is that the time to innovate is not when something stops working, but actually the time to innovate is when something new starts to work. Now this idea applies not just to product development, it applies to any other business process. For example, finding new customers or finding new audiences. And when you see your users starting to move towards a new kind of consumer behavior, you know that it's time to act, and it's time to act now, and with conviction. We're actually in the middle of some such similar consumer shift today. To put it very simply, the world is turning vertical. We're in the middle of a massive shift towards mobile-first, interactive, digital, vertical video content. In fact, what we're seeing is that about 4 out of 5 people are telling us that they like to hold their phones vertically or in the portrait mode. Now, this is not really kind of news or kind of like, exciting, because if you kind of think about it, our culture has largely been built and captured in portrait mode, hasn't it? And much more recently, mobile phones have almost always been vertical. And so it's only now that brands and businesses are starting to think about how to build in this digital or this kind of vertical world that we're living in. So, for example, you're seeing examples of Twitter using vertical moments, or Spotify creating, again, music content for vertical behavior. And also, artists like Taylor Swift are shooting their music videos in vertical format as well. And this idea doesn't just stop around digital content creation. In fact, a lot of hardware companies are also starting to build out these experiences. So you would have seen recently the launch of Vertical TV, which was launched by Samsung, to really kind of connect with the mobile-first generation, or as we call them, millennials. And at the very forefront of this shift to verticality, if I can use that word, is stories. This is a format that has kind of taken hold globally and captured the imagination of people, and has really changed the way that people communicate, share, and express themselves. Stories are giving people the power to enhance their creativity when it comes to communication and expression. And this is also manifesting itself in the kind of behavior that we're seeing on our own platform. Across the family of apps of Facebook, each of our story services today has 500 million daily active users on our story services. As you know, we launched stories first with Instagram, and then seeing the rapid behavior and movement, we actually quickly launched them across on Facebook, Messenger, and then also with WhatsApp with status. And closer to home, in Philippines, we're starting to hear that almost 75% of people are saying that they like to consume stories on 3 or more platforms at least once a week. And this idea of consumption of stories is not limited to just consumption. Actually, across the Facebook family of apps, on any given day, 1 billion stories are created and shared. That's an enormous amount of content that is being generated across the Facebook family of apps. And this is likely to continue. Folks in the Philippines are telling us that they plan to use even more stories than they do at the moment. Now, I've talked a little bit about numbers and daily active users and all of these percentages, but what is perhaps the most interesting thing about this shift is how these new set of storytellers are actually kind of embracing products and brands in their experiences. That's the real story here. 69% of people in the Philippines are telling us that they've actually become interested in a product or a brand after seeing a story around it. And so while businesses are continuing to adopt stories, and we see people adopting stories, when it comes to advertising, there's still many skeptics out there who think that ideas have to be physically big to actually make an impact. And so this is an example of a digital agency chief digital officer who's talking about this massive poster site. But we know at Facebook that ideas don't have to be physically big for them to be impactful. Stories can do it. But in order to do that, you really have to commit to kind of cutting through all of the noise and connecting with these newer audiences who are all very digital savvy, who are all very fickle, and who are all also thinking about new ways of content consumption. And so here is some of the examples of brands who are really taking this idea of innovation to heart and kind of building out some really interesting use cases around stories. This was Hotels.com. I love the way that McDonald's has done this really interesting video around their new delivery services, or even Calvin Klein, which is using kind of vintage information to kind of create stories as well. And all of this work from brands and businesses is getting rewarded as well. Earlier this year at the Webby's 2019, the New York Public Library's Instagram novel series was awarded as the best use of stories for this year. It was the first time this award has been instituted as well. And so, everything, there are many brands who are kind of seeing success with stories. But one of the most interesting things that we're seeing really today is that the one thing that they have in common is that they're committing to this idea of innovation, specifically idea of innovation when it comes to creative, because nowhere is creative more valuable and useful than in stories itself. So I want to talk a little bit today about this concept of commitment. What does it mean to commit to this kind of innovation, and what does commitment look like? And I'm going to kind of speak through three different threads. And the first one, the one that I really want to pull quickly, is around understanding why is it that stories are kind of so loved, and why do people use it? And more importantly, what are they expecting to see in stories when it comes to brands as well? So let's talk about that. The number one reason why people love stories is because, well, they are full screen, which means that they bring the viewer's focus to the content entirely. And because they're also optimized for the vertical screen, it basically means that you can quickly consume a lot of photos and images rather quickly. They're also ephemeral, and they are kind of short form, so they're less than 15 seconds, and they disappear after 24 hours, which means that there's really no need for your story to kind of come up as the most perfect example. And therefore, people have lesser cognitive load when it comes to creating stories as well. They're also very much interactive and authentic, which means that you're using all of these interesting interactivity tools to kind of really power their unique version of storytelling. And finally, they're also very playful, which means that they're using the best of what is available today in terms of camera effects, in terms of creative tools, in terms of photos, videos, and GIFs to kind of, create their own style of storytelling. This is really shifting the way that people have started communicating and sharing across the world today. Right, let's kind of move to thinking about how and what kind of content do people want to see in stories, which is a little bit different than how the content is kind of consumed in our news feed. So for example, the number one thing that we hear from folks using stories is they want to see kind of an insider's view of their favorite celebrities that they follow. People also love to follow brands on stories, and they want to see a lot of relevant updates and product information that allows them to kind of keep ahead of what brands that they follow are up to. So that's really interesting and a little bit different in the way that they consume content on our newsfeed platform, which is the original platform. Right, let's talk a little bit about thinking of what does it mean to committing to what's possible on stories. What makes the stories format so special? Now, this idea is that stories is perhaps the only sharing platform that is combining text, photos, videos, interactivity, and creative tools to kind of really create this wonderful expression, which is, the only format which is kind of pulling together in a place where users are, which is on mobile, and in a way that they're already naturally using their device, which is vertical. And that's what makes stories kind of so special. I want to give you some examples of what kind of unconventional storytelling is happening across stories today. And I've got 3 examples to share with you today. The first one is from Ever Stories. Now, this is a really interesting and a provocative way of trying to get the mobile-first generation or the young audiences to connect with Holocaust remembrance, kind of like, memorabilia, because as you know, the Holocaust survivors are now dying out. And so these kind of stories are based on the real-life diaries of Eva Heyman from 1944. The second example is and I referenced this a little bit earlier from New York Public Libraries, where they're really creating these wonderful Instagram novels, if you can call them that, in an attempt to get young folks to start reading a little bit more. Because as we know, like, people are not really reading that often, especially when it comes to the millennials. And then the third example I want to share with you is from HGTV. It's a home improvement channel, which is really capitalizing on this idea of trying to kind of do renovation projects that converts people's houses into homes as well. And as we see that brands are starting to kind of use all of these innovative ways of pulling together some really interesting ways of using interactivity in their content, we're also starting to think through what are the next kind of things that we need to build out to support all of the brands and businesses that are using some of our features. So let's take interactivity, for example. 60% of the businesses who are on Instagram stories today tell us that they're using some kind of interactivity already. That could include a location tag, or it could include an at mention, or even a polling sticker. So what we did was we decided to include or extend this idea of interactivity to advertising as well. And earlier this year, we launched the interactive polling sticker ads on Instagram stories. This basically helps a user to see your ad a little bit longer and then express an opinion on that ad. And what is amazing is that the brands and businesses are starting to use this format to crowdsource insights. And they're also trying to co-create and launch new variants of this product. So it's really interesting in the way that brands and businesses are using this particular ad format. Another really unique way that businesses are doing this is using our Native Stories carousel ad, which is also very interesting because they're thinking through mimicking how users are organically using our platform.